Welcome to Sharara, Hope from the Heart of Crisis. In this podcast, we share stories from conflict-affected parts of the Middle East and North Africa, places scarred by the war, yet alive with resilience. Here, science and innovation rise from the rubble, and creativity persists even under bombardment. You will hear the voices of researchers, scientists, and activists who continue to create against all odds. Each episode takes you into the lives of people facing the toughest crises and reveals how they confront challenges with determination, ingenuity, and hope. Join us to meet those who ignite the spark of possibility and remind us that even in the darkest times, hope can shine. Amid the conflicts tearing through the region, displaced people and refugees leave behind their homes and dreams, seeking only survival. Their first shelter is often a tent, fragile against harsh weather and unable to preserve dignity. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, by the end of 2024, the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide has exceeded 120 million. Among them, around 43 million are refugees, alongside about 74 million internally displaced people. 73% of refugees are hosted by low and middle-income countries. These nations often have to set aside lands on the edges of cities or along borders, offering rapid solutions that too often lack the basics of dignity and humanity. So, what does the very first shelter look like? This is where the story of the refugee tent begins and how it has gradually evolved into safer shelters and more durable units. Before we move on, let's hear from engineer Lina Younes, shelter officer at UNHCR Jordan office. She explains the Global Shelter Cluster, an international coordination body that brings together hundreds of humanitarian agencies. Its role is to ensure that displaced people receive safe shelters and sustainable settlements by unifying efforts, sharing resources, and avoiding duplication.
By coordinating our efforts, sharing our innovations, and putting communities at the center of our response, we can ensure that everyone has not just a shelter, but a foundation for rebuilding their lives. The Global Shelter Cluster was established in 2005. It was born from a recognition that when disasters strike or conflicts erupt, or sometimes both, the humanitarian response was too fragmented. People were falling through the cracks, literally sleeping under torn traps, while different organizations worked in silos. Today, the Global Shelter Cluster is a partnership of over 695 organizations, from UN agencies to community-based groups, co-led by UNHCR for conflict situations and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or the IFRC, for natural disasters at the global level. This is used for non-refugee humanitarian emergencies, as often co-led with governments and or co-chaired with NGO partners. However, what makes it special is that it's not just about setting up tents faster. Shelter Cluster is an interagency mechanism coordinating shelter, settlement, and shelter-related non-food items, or the NFIs.
Now that we understand the cluster's role in coordinating humanitarian efforts, let's look at its innovative side. Beyond providing immediate shelter, the cluster is constantly testing and improving new approaches, making shelters safer, more durable, and better adapted to people's needs?
I would say our role is not only during the provision of shelters, but also proactive and reactive to different scenarios and potential risks. For example, when overnight rain had flooded part of a new settlement in one of the locations, and 200 families were standing in ankle-deep water, we promptly conducted a rapid assessment, not only counting damaged shelters, but also understanding vulnerabilities, coordinating with emergency response teams for different agencies and local authorities, working with our WASH colleagues to dewater and declutter drainages, with our supply team to procure sleeping platforms, and with protection staff to ensure vulnerable families get priority support. By the end of this process, I am already shifting back to longer-term planning. This is where the technical side of my role comes in. I'm reviewing architectural drawings for the shelters. These are engineered structures that need to withstand the different climates and using locally available material and incorporating traditional building techniques that displaced people and/or refugees can recognize from their home communities. All shelter decisions we made are protection decisions. When I'm working out a settlement plan, I need to think about whether vulnerable individuals can travel safely to water points and latrines, especially at night. When we are working out shelter themselves, we remember privacy, especially for adolescents, girls, women, and disabled individuals who may have a history of abuse. In Bangladesh's camps, we learned that shelter design affects protection in ways we hadn't initially anticipated. Originally, the shelters were so closely crowded that a lack of privacy resulted in domestic violence, and fires could quickly spread across entire neighborhoods. Today, these neighborhoods have better spacing, stronger material that provides sound privacy, and design features that optimize neutral and natural ventilation, reducing health threats and the risk of fire. In the same camp, the team has been piloting something called lime-stabilized soil shelters, as the camp faces brutal monsoons every year, and traditional bamboo and tarpaulin shelters simply couldn't withstand the flooding and winds. The innovation combines locally available material to blend into plaster that makes bamboo shelters fireproof and flood-proof. What makes this special isn't just the technology, but how it was developed. Rohingya refugees themselves were part of the design process, ensuring the shelters reflected their cultural preferences while addressing climate changes. The results have been remarkable. These shelters can withstand monsoon floods and provide 5 to 7 degrees of cooling during brutal summer heat. It has been built using skills that the vulnerable groups are able to learn and also share, and has created a sense of ownership rather than dependency.
Next, we hear from Engineer Tariq Saadeddin, head of the technical unit at UNHCR Mafraq Sub-Office, Jordan. He reflects on the early days of life in the camp and the shift towards safe, more sustainable shelters.
The prolonged nature of modern displacement, with over 130 million forcibly displaced people globally, has shifted the humanitarian shelter mindset from short-term emergency solutions to durable, dignified living environments. Tents, once the default for rapid response, were never intended to house families for years. As crises became more protracted, the humanitarian sector faced a moral and practical imperative to transition toward shelter solutions that provide safety, privacy, and stability. The turning point came as displacement patterns changed, refugees staying longer, often in climate-exposed areas or urban fringes. This reality led UNHCR and partners to introduce semi-permanent shelters, such as prefabricated units, locally built homes, and hybrid shelter kits, often co-designed with the displaced communities themselves. This transition offered more than protection from weather. It enabled social recovery. Families could lock a door, children could return to learning, and neighbors could build communities. These upgrades symbolized hope, not just housing.
With small innovations that made a real difference in refugees' lives, engineer Saduddin explains how shelters in the camp evolved from fragile tents that offered little protection from heat or cold to prefabricated shelter units designed with better ventilation, proper insulation, and access to electricity.
Over the last decade, global shelter responses have integrated a wide range of technical innovations, such as modular shelter kits that are easily deployed and upgraded using local materials. These kits allow families to adapt to local conditions and build progressively. Thermal insulation and passive ventilation is also critical in extreme climates, particularly in regions experiencing heat waves or sub-zero winters. Solutions include reflective roofing, insulated walls, and breathable materials. Now, speaking of energy, solar lanterns, clean cook stoves, and mini grids are being rolled out in many camps and off-grid settlements. These types of solutions reduce dependency on unsafe fuels and improve lighting, safety, and livelihoods. In terms of site planning, enhanced drainage, fire breaks, and inclusive access routes for persons with disabilities or mobility issues have improved camp safety and functionality. Together, all these innovations restore autonomy, reduce exposure to climate risks, and improve physical and mental health. People can study longer, sleep better, and feel safer, all because of thoughtful, context-driven design.
Improving shelter is not a luxury. It is an urgent humanitarian need, yet it faces obstacles, especially funding gaps and logistical barriers. Many of these challenges have, in fact, opened the door for innovations. How? Let's listen.
Every challenge in shelter response, whether it's limited funding, harsh terrain, or overcrowding, becomes an opportunity to innovate and adapt. For example, when it comes to budget constraints, we need to promote incremental sheltering, begin with a core unit, and provide technical support for families to expand it over time using available materials. This fosters ownership and cost efficiency. Now, when we speak about harsh environments, this kind of challenge demands locally adapted materials. In flood-prone areas, shelters are usually elevated. In earthquake zones, lightweight and flexible materials are used. These solutions are not imported. They are contextual. Now, to deal with population density, for example, this type of challenge calls for spatial planning, including shared community kitchens, communal learning spaces, and green areas. One universal lesson is that solutions cannot be copy-pasted. They must be designed with, not just for, the communities affected. The best shelter programs engage refugees and displaced persons as co-creators, not only beneficiaries.
Zaatari camp in eastern Jordan has hosted thousands of Syrian refugees since 2012. It is a living example of hope born in the hardest conditions. What began with tents has now become a city of caravans.
Zaatari, which was once a barren desert camp, has become a model of humanitarian urbanism, which hosted over 70,000 refugees at some point. It evolved from a chaotic tent city to a structured, community-driven space with grid-based planning, markets, and shops. We're talking about over 1,400 shops at some point, prefabricated housing with power and water infrastructure, solar power plant, and solar energy powering streetlights and homes. Zaatari is not just a camp. It's a living demonstration of resilience. By combining humanitarian principles with urban planning and empowering refugees to improve their own environment, Zaatari shows that even the most difficult settings can become places of agency and recovery.
Years of displacement have also inspired engineers and inventors to search for new solutions. Among them is Abir Saykali, a Jordanian architect who designed a smart tent that generates solar power and collects rainwater for daily use. Her tent is resistant to fire, earthquakes, and wind. It folds easily for transport and can accommodate an entire family. Yet, as the challenges of displacement grow, the Global Shelter Cluster is now working on strategies that look to the future, going beyond immediate needs toward more sustainable, resilient, and long-term solutions. Let's hear Lina once more on this vision.
That's one of the most valuable aspects of our work. Whether it's the global shelter cluster approach or the refugee coordination model, we are constantly learning from each other across contexts. But it's not copying and pasting responses. It's taking principles and applying them to local context. Let me take flood resilience, for example. In the Bangladesh camp, we found the application of lime-stabilized soil methodology and raised platforms to withstand monsoon flooding. When we had the same issues during South Sudan's rainy season, we couldn't use the same material. Lime is not found there, but we could apply the same principles. We used local wood and local construction techniques that communities were familiar with to build raised shelter designs. In conflict zones, you can't rely on long-term planning. We need to develop what we call adaptive strategies. Shelter solutions that can be quickly modified, relocated, or abandoned if security deteriorates. This might mean designing modular shelters that can be disassembled and moved, or pre-positioning emergency supplies in multiple locations, so we can respond quickly to a new displacement. We have global minimum sphere standards for shelter size, structural safety, fire resistance, and protection features. These are non-negotiable. They save lives and dignity. The most important lesson is that displacement does not end when people find shelter. It's when they find the opportunity to rebuild their lives with dignity. Every family I've worked with, whether in a camp or in an urban setting, wants the same thing, not just a roof over their heads, but the chance to create a home where they can plan for their future. The global shelter cluster and refugee coordination model exist because we've learned that providing the opportunity requires all of us, governments, international organizations, local communities, and displaced people themselves, working better and working together.
The search for dignified shelter for refugees is not just about temporary fixes. It's about innovations and lessons born in crisis. It reflects human stories and daily resilience. These sparks of hope travel across conflict zones, shaping new solutions.
My message to refugees: your strength, adaptability, and resourcefulness are the foundations of every shelter we build. Even when the walls are thin, your spirit makes them strong. You transform space into home. My message to the world: displacement is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of resilience and reinvention. Each crisis brings hard lessons, but also sparks breakthroughs in shelter, energy, and protection. Let us not waste those lessons. On the horizon, I believe shelter development is focusing on climate-resilient design for floods, droughts, and temperature extremes, shelter systems that use biodegradable or reusable components, and digital mapping and data to guide smarter site planning and emergency response. Finally, I believe these efforts recognize one truth: shelter is not just a place to sleep, it is where recovery begins.
Dear listeners of Sharara, this has been a journey through the evolution of refugee shelter, from fragile tents to durable units. Follow us on Spotify, Anghami, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, and SoundCloud. For more on this episode's topic, visit the Arabic edition of sideof.net. And to contact our reporters and producers, please join our Facebook page, Sharara. This episode was reported and written by Najat Shana'a, sideof.net's correspondent in Jordan. I'm Lamia Yassin. Thank you for listening to Sharara, Hope from the Heart of Crisis. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and don't forget to follow our Facebook page for more updates and to get in touch.